Okay, just about ready. All right. Good morning, my dear friends. It's so good to have you. Today, I wanted to tell you that we've hit a milestone in Tanya, in this milestone work of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and it's a very, very special day today. Move these. So what I would like to do today is, my goal today is to encapsulate for you all of what we've learned until this point. So in the last 3 months, we began Tanya, and we've covered each week another idea, another concept, another chapter of this magnum opus, of this incredible, monumental work, which really takes a human being into a deep dive into his psyche, into his soul, to understand exactly what the mechanics are, how they play themselves out, and in exactly the way how a person should be able to understand what's going on inside of them so that they should be able to deal with the struggles that life takes us on. So today, as I told you in the past, the Tanya is really broken down into subsections. It's 53 chapters. The whole first book of Tanya is 53 chapters, but really it's subdivided into different parts. And the first part of Tanya takes us on a journey from chapter 1 through chapter 8. And what the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, what he does in these first 8 chapters is he gives us a new vocabulary of how to understand the rest of Tanya. In other words, the Tanya is an instructional book. It's a book that allows us to understand, teaches us how to live our life as a Jew. As the Alter Rebbe said in the title page, he's explaining the work, Ki kareh lecha davar me'od. He's explaining the verse that Moses told the Jewish people that the Torah that I gave you is exceedingly near for you to fulfill, to accomplish, to live your life in sync with God, to live your life in a way that's meaningful, that's genuine, that's passionate, that you wake up every morning and you know the direction that your life needs to be in. Moses tells the Jewish people right before he dies that this is possible. Not only it's possible, ki karov elecha hadavar me'od, is exceedingly close for you. So the Alter Rebbe says, in this book, I'm going to teach you how this is exceedingly close. And I'm going to do it in a way that is a long and short way. In other words, I'm going to give you the tools. I'm going to give you the vocabulary. I'm going to take you by your hand, one step at a time, in a very, very systematic way, so that you can understand the workings of your soul. And in this way, you can understand the tools that you need to be able to live the life that you're going to live. So in chapter 1, now I'm going to give you a little summary. Today, we're going to go from chapters 1 through 8. And with this, you'll have everything that you need in order to do the rest of Tanya. So if the rest of Tanya is instructional, chapters 1 to 8 is the information. Or if you look at, if Tanya is a cookbook, then chapters 1 through 8 is the ingredients, and the rest of Tanya is the recipe. And it's very intuitive the way it works. One thing always leads to the other. So the Alter Rebbe begins like this. He begins with an existential problem. And that existential problem is, we learn that when God puts the soul into the world, in other words, when the soul is embodied, it comes down into the world. We learn in the Talmud teaches us that the soul is given to swear. In other words, it's given an oath. And the oath is Tihi Tzadik v'al Tihi Rasha. You shall be righteous and you shall not be wicked. V'afilu kol ha'olam kulo. Even if the entire world tells you Tzadik ata, that you are righteous. Hayei beinacha kirasha. In other words, your job in the world, your job is Tihi Tzadik, to do what God wants of you. And don't get lost in the world around you by the things that pull you. However, you should never look at yourself like you're righteous. You should always look at yourself like you're a Rasha. So now the Rebbe right away wants to understand what is a tzaddik and what is a Rasha. What is it? So to understand this, the Rebbe says that really if you go through all of the Talmudic work and all of Jewish literature, you do find actually that there are three character traits that exist within the human being in Jewish tradition. There's a tzaddik, a Rasha, and a Beinoni. Tzaddik is probably the highest level, Rasha is the lowest level, Beinoni is somewhere in the middle. And now the Rebbe really doesn't get to the bottom of what each of these are, although he does conclude that a tzaddik is somebody who it's impossible that he even commits one sin against God. In other words, a tzaddik is somebody who his whole life and every part of his life is completely in line with God's will. That's a tzaddik. A Rasha is somebody who is struggling through life. He's really struggling. Everything that he does and his day is not in sync. He's out of sync with what he's supposed to be doing. He's totally not in line with God's will. And then somewhere in between is the Beinoni. And this, the Alter Rebbe really struggles to try and understand. Who is this Beinoni? What is he? Is he just in between one and the other? It doesn't seem to be right, because Rabbah, one of the great sages, taught, Amar Rabbah said, Kigoyin ana Beinoni. You want to know what a Beinoni is? I'm like a Beinoni. So certainly a Beinoni can't be like halfway tzaddik, halfway Rosh. It's not like a halfway house, because this great sage was somebody who was so great that he never stopped studying Torah even for a minute. And besides, once a person sins, they're already a Rasha. And if they do tshuva, if they repent, then they're already a tzaddik. So at what point does a person become a Beinoni? So this is the existential question that the Alter Rebbe is trying to figure out. And at the end of the first chapter, he tells us that in order to understand this query, we need to first understand and dive into this Lurianic piece of Kabbalah that tells us that in every single Jewish soul, in every single Jewish person, in every person, there exists two souls, a godly soul and a human soul. And first, he goes into the human soul. He explains to us what it is. The human soul is somebody, or it's an existence, it's a thing, it's an operating system within the human being that is looking out for self-interest, self-preservation, selfishness, survival mode. It's looking to take care of its needs. So a human being takes care of its needs. That's a product of the animal soul, of the human soul. He calls it the animal soul later on in Tanya because essentially an animal has the same drives. It's looking for self-preservation. It's looking for survival. It's looking for its own needs, right? That's kind of an animalistic tendencies that human beings have. And when we say animalistic, it's not necessarily bad or good. It's just survival. It's looking out for my needs. And the Alter Rebbe tells us that the good character traits within a Jew within a person comes from that soul. The fact that a person is both merciful, giving, kind, empathetic, it's from that soul. Also, the negative character traits come from that soul. The fact that a person has chaos, has anger, has issues with temper, is flaring up, has very strong emotions that are fiery, that are passionate. the fact that a person has looking for pleasure, which is more cold, pleasureful things, looking to indulge in pleasures, the fact that a person is ready to just waste away hours and hours on end on idle chatter and really nothingness, it has no substance. Or even the fact that a person is very heavy and he feels depressed, he feels anxious, he feels like melancholy, that also really comes from this same animal soul. So really anything that has to do with survival, anything that has to do with self-preservation, it comes from this place. In chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe tells us, moving on from chapter 1 to chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe tells us that there's also a godly soul. This godly soul is really, it's a piece of God extended all the way down into the human being. So in other words, a human being not only has this ability to be in survival mode, to be selfish, to look out for its own needs, the human being also has this ability to be transcendent, to transcend, to allow himself to go beyond his survival needs, his personal needs. A person has the ability to really connect with something that's beyond him at every single moment. And this godly soul really, it stems from God himself. And as it comes down through the spiritual stratosphere, the spiritual worlds, which basically can be described as 4 levels. God Almighty has a vision, has a thought to create the world. The world is created in 4 steps. And those are really essentially the 4 worlds. They're really 4 levels of perception. There's emanation, there's creation, there is formation, and then there's actualization. It's 4 levels in anything that a person ever wants to do, to create a project, to create a business, to write a book, to go on a vacation. There's always going to be these 4 levels of emanation, creation, formation, and actualization, which we talked about at length in chapter 2, I believe. So within the spiritual realm, God creating the world, there's also these 4 spiritual worlds. And the soul comes down on a journey through those 4 worlds. And every soul is impacted in a different way by that journey. And that's why there are some souls that are more sensitive to spirituality and some that are more crass and less spiritually sensitive. It's because of that journey of the soul. So everybody's really different. But what we do know is that this piece of God that's inside of us is very powerful. And it has the ability to allow us to transcend our human experience and to connect to God. Now the Alter Rebbe moves from chapter 2 to chapter 3, and he tells us that in chapter 3, I'm going to talk about first the godly soul. Let's talk about the godly soul. The godly soul is its own operating system. So in other words, there is 2 operating systems within each and every human being that are constantly in battle with each other. And we'll talk about that starting from chapter 9. But here the Alter Rebbe is just giving us the ideas, the vocabulary. He's giving us a peek into our psyche. In chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe tells us that this godly soul has a set of character traits. And these character traits, they are essentially divided into 2 parts. They are intellect and emotion. There are 3 intellectual faculties, 7 emotional faculties. And they are Chachma, Bina, Dat. Those are the 3 intellectual faculties. What are they in English? Chachma means the ability to be creative, intuitive, wisdom. Bina means the ability to take that creativity, that intuition, and to bring it down and to really comprehend. It's comprehensive. It's comprehension. You're taking an idea and you're really pulling it all apart. You're really allowing yourself to get into it, to really figure out all the different mechanics of this idea, of this creative idea, intuitive idea. And that's called Chachma and Bina, father and mother. And then there is Das. Das is the third. Das is really focus. Das is the ability to to allow yourself to focus so much on the idea that you can create an emotion from it. And that's the idea that the Alter Rebbe is telling us. Das is intellectual intimacy. He calls the intellect parents, and he calls the emotions children. One thing is a very strong, they lead one to the other. So intellect leads to emotions in the godly soul. So there's Chachma, Bina, Das. There's creativity, comprehension, and then there's focus. That's the intellect, that's the parents. They're the ones that create emotions. What are the emotions? The emotions are simply chesed, is kindness, love, the ability to be giving. Gevura is the ability to be assertive, to be disciplined, to be strong. And Tiferes is the middle one, it's charisma, a good balance of the two. Netzach, on the right side, under chesed. Netzach means competitiveness, right? Competitiveness means a person that wants to be very much involved in what he's doing. And then on the left side, you have hod. Hod means devotion. Somebody who has boundaries, somebody who has assertiveness is also going to be very, very devoted to the cause. They're going to be very, they're going to be there with you always. They're not going to be flaky. And then there's Yesod. Yesod is connectivity, right? Somebody who has Tiferet, who's charismatic, also knows how to connect to people in a very good way. And then there's Malchut, which is the sum total of all of them. Kingship or leadership, which doesn't add or subtract anything from the person, but it allows a person to be aloof, to be in a leadership position. So in other words, there are some people that are right-sided people that are giving, that are creative types of souls, that are artists, that are intuitive, they're giving, they're loving, and they're very competitive. And those types of people, they could also be flaky. They're not very good with time, and they're not very good with being on time, being devoted to a cause, seeing it through. Sometimes they do it and they stop in the middle. People on the left side are more gevura, more they begin with comprehension. They need to understand everything fully. They have good boundaries. They're very assertive, and they're going to stick with it all the way. And the people in the middle, they have a good balance of both, right? They're very charismatic, but it starts with das. It starts with the ability to be in tune, to focus. And then there's charisma, and that leads to connectivity, right? So you have the different types of personality traits. So in chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe is telling us that the soul, the godly soul, it has a whole makeup. Its character trait is based on one of these 10, 2 of these 10, 3 of these 10. Some people are more like this, some people are more like that, based on the nurture of one of these character traits. But the point is also that you should know that emotion is a byproduct of intellect. Okay. Chapter 4, the Rebbe moves on and tells us that chapter 3 told us who you are. This is who you are. You are the way God created you, your character traits, your personality, that's who you are. But then there's what you do. And don't mix it up. There's who you are and what you do. So in chapter 4, he goes on to tell us that there's also what you do. What is what you do? So that is the way that the soul expresses itself. The way that the soul expresses itself is what you do. When people look at you and they describe you, right? They describe you according to who you are, but they don't know really about who you are. How do they know who you are? How do they know your personality? They only know your personality by the way that you express your personality traits. And that is in thought, speech, and action. Thought, speech, and action is really thought is the way you express your inner being to yourself. That's thought. And speech and action is the way you express yourself to others. This is called, the Alter Rebbe calls it levushim, garments. Why does he call it garments? Because who you are, that's who you are. You can't change it. But your garments, you could change. If I'm wearing this jacket, I can take it off. If I want to dress like a clown today, I could. People will think I'm kind of strange, but I could do it. If I want to put my hat on, I could put my hat on and I could take it off. Your clothing you could take on and off at will. And Alter Rebbe is going to tell us that with the expression of the soul, your thought, speech, and action, you are in full control over those. Thought, you don't necessarily control what goes into your mind, but you can certainly think about, you certainly have control over what you meditate on, what you fantasize about, what you allow to go all the way in and to really think through. You have control over that. You have control over what you say, and you have control over what you do. These are garments of your soul. The garments of your soul, you have full control over. There's something called impulse control. You could control what you say and what you do and what you think about. So that's chapter 4. Then Alter Rebbe takes us into chapter 5. And in chapter 5, the Alter Rebbe tells us that besides for the clothing that the soul has, the soul also has food. The analogy of food is Torah. Torah study. Why is it called food? Because Torah study is not just an experience. When you do a mitzvah, it's also like a garment. You do a mitzvah, it's like a garment. It protects you for those moments you're doing the mitzvah. When you're finished doing the mitzvah, the experience is over. And the protection no longer protects you. As long as you're doing a good deed, that good deed is an experience that you're putting yourself into. When the good deed is done, of course, you're rewarded for that good deed. But the experience is no longer with you anymore. That's why you have to continue doing more mitzvot. With Torah, it's different. It's not like a garment. Torah is like food. Because when you study Torah, not only are you experiencing the Torah study, you're having an experience of Torah study. The Torah study is also going inside of you. And because it's going inside of you, that's where the key difference is. The study that you're doing, you're experiencing it, but it's also being experienced inside of you. That means even when you stop studying Torah, you are still connected to the Torah study that you're learning because now it is in you. When you do a mitzvah, it's an external act. You do it, you walk away, and you move on to something else. It's no longer with you. With Torah, it's different because when you study Torah, not only are you involved in the experience externally, you also become involved in the experience internally. It becomes part of you. Now that it becomes part of you, it never ceases to exist. It's always with you. Not only that, it starts to slowly become your worldview. You start looking at the world through the lenses of the Torah that you study. So it becomes your worldview. And then people can even see on you, when you study a lot of Torah, people look at you and say, wow, you're more refined. You're more refined because you can see it on you. It's the same thing with food. Food goes in you. It's an experience. It's a culinary experience, but it goes in you. Not only it goes in you, what you eat becomes who you are. If you eat healthy, you look healthy. If you eat unhealthy for many years, you start to look unhealthy. If you don't exercise, you start to get excess. The point is, you can see it on the person when they're eating and when they're not eating. When they're eating healthy, when they're not eating healthy, you can see it on a person. Same thing with Torah. When you study Torah, it becomes part of you. Your worldview changes and people can see it on you. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6, Alter Rebbe goes and says, you know what? We've discussed the entire first operating system, really the second, the godly soul. We discussed the godly soul, who he is. It's made up of 10 building blocks. We discussed what he does. That is the way it expresses itself in thought, speech, and action of mitzvot, Torah. And in chapter 5, we discussed another element of the godly soul where it can become one with God. Chapter 5 also, the Alter Rebbe said, one of the most unique things about Torah is that when a Jew studies Torah, he becomes one with God. He becomes one with God's essence. So that's chapter 5. Not only do you have clothing, you also have food. And it changes the way you look, the way you act, the way you feel. It becomes part of your worldview. Chapter 6, the Alter Rebbe starts to tell us that everything in the world God created completely balanced. So whatever there is in spirituality, there exists in impurity. In other words, God created the world balanced. There's impurity, there's unholiness, and there's holiness. And they have the same amount of power. So whenever there's more holiness in the world, God's going to add more unholiness to the world. That's why whenever you try to do something good, holy, you're always going to encounter difficulty. You're always going to encounter an obstacle. Why? Because whenever godliness, holiness is introduced into the world, into your psyche, into your stratosphere, unholiness will be introduced there as well. Because it needs to be a level playing field. So the Alter Rebbe begins and he says in chapter 6, just like the godly soul had 10 building blocks for the operating system of the godly soul, the animal soul also has 10 building blocks. The same 10 building blocks. In other words, there are 2 operating systems within the person. It's not like there's one person with different personalities. There are 2 people inside of you. Each of them have their own way of connecting. The animal soul also has, the natural soul also has 10 building blocks. The only thing is that these building blocks, Alter Rebbe tells us, they function in a little bit of a different way. Everything is the same. Chachma Bina Dat is the same. The intellectual building blocks are the same. The emotional building blocks are the same. It's all exactly the same. The only thing is, whereas in the godly soul, the intellect creates an emotion. In the animal soul, it works the opposite way around. Right? We said in the godly soul, the parents are the ones who run the house. They're the ones who tell the children what to do, right? That's how it works in the godly soul. First you cogitate, first you think before you act, think before you speak, right? First you think and then you create from that thinking a healthy emotion. In the animal soul, it's the opposite. In the animal soul, the Alter Rebbe first tells us about the emotions and then he tells us about the intellect. Because what happens is, in the animal soul, a person is drawn to something right away with his emotions. But then afterwards, your friend comes over and says, "What the heck are you thinking?" Your wife comes over and says, "How could you do this to me?" Right? You did something with your emotions. You had this emotion that created either speech or action, whatever it was. And you did it without thinking, right? Because in the godly soul, you think first and then you have the emotion. In the animal soul, the emotion comes first. And then afterwards, you think to yourself, boy, that was stupid. Now I have to rationalize it. Oh, rationalization. I have to say, I did it because I was having a bad day. I did it because I'm emotionally in a wreck. I did it because at work my boss screamed at me. I had to do it because my wife got in a fight with me. I have to do it because you come up with all these reasons why you do things. But that comes after you did it already. It comes after the emotion. First there's the emotion, then there's the intellect. You understand? It's the same 10 building blocks. But instead of the parents running the house, running the children are running the parents. The children are the ones making the rules in the house, and the parents are listening. You understand? This is the animal soul. So that's chapter 6. Chapter 7, Alter Rebbe tells us that this animal soul, it comes from something called Klipat Noga, which means it stems from a place called Klipat Noga, the animal soul. The godly soul is holy, it's Kedusha. It's holy. The animal soul comes from a place called Klipat Noga. Klipat Noga means a shell, a husk that is translucent. In other words, there's brightness inside of that there's a fruit inside. It's covered by a shell, and you can see the fruit inside, but you can't access it unless you remove the shell. That's called klipat noga. Klipat noga means a shining or a translucent shell. Klipa means a shell. Noga means it's shining. That's klipat noga. So there's kedusha, holiness. Then there's klipat noga. There's the unholiness, but inside of it there lies a light. Inside of it there lies potential. Lower than that is something called shalosh klipot atmeot, the 3 impure klipot. And that is like a fruit with a shell that is so powerful, so strong, that you cannot see the fruit. You cannot access the fruit. So there are really 3 levels, Alter Rebbe tells us in chapter 7. There's holiness up here. There's complete unholiness here, that you do not have any access to the light that's inside of it, right? Because everything is created by God. So everything has a divine spark, even if it's unholy. But there's a difference. Most things in the world, you can access that spiritual light. But there are some things in the world that you cannot access the spiritual light. So that's the difference. There's shalosh klipot atmeot means impurity that is so strong, the peel or the shell or the husk, that the light that's inside of it is inaccessible. And then there is a shell that the light inside of it is accessible. So the Alter Rebbe wants to tell us that this animal soul, it comes from a place called klipat noga. It comes from a place that is not holy, but you can access the good inside of it. You got to work it, but you can access the good. It's accessible. So therefore, when you're dealing with the animal soul, everything that it encounters in thought, speech, and action is going to be one of 2 things. It's going to be either klipat noga, or it's going to be shalosh klipat atmeot. It's either going to be something which is accessible or inaccessible. And then, of course, the third option is a holiness, which the light is shining. There's nothing that's blocking it. So the Alter Rebbe tells us, if you look at the world in the Hasidic worldview, in the way that the Alter Rebbe looks at the world, and the way he tells us to look at the world is, when you look at the world, look at it like this. There are things in the world that are holy. And that would be studying Torah, that makes you holy, that connects you to God. There's doing a mitzvah. Doing a mitzvah is also taking the material world and making it holy, right? And then there's unholiness. Unholiness means things that are inaccessible, things that the Torah tells us we're not allowed to do. The Torah says, for example, that you cannot eat on Yom Kippur. If you eat on Yom Kippur, that's taking food and it's making it unholy. Let's take an easier example. The Torah says that there are certain foods that are kosher and certain foods that are unkosher, right? So those kosher foods, they're not holy. They're klipat noga. They're not holy. When a person eats them and uses that energy, makes a blessing over them, and uses the energy for good things, then he's elevating that food to holiness. When a person indulges in things that are not kosher, in other words, that God tells us we're not allowed to do, we're not allowed to eat, well, that's unholiness. It's inaccessible. The godly light inside of it is inaccessible. So I won't be able to eat that and elevate the experience. I can't. It's impossible. So I feel like I'm not being clear. Let me be a little bit more clear. The world around us, anything that a Jew encounters, anything that a human being encounters, there are 3 possibilities. There's holiness, there's unholiness, and there's almost everything in between. Almost every single thing in the world that a Jew encounters is going to be in the middle. It's called klipat noga. What does that mean that it's klipat noga? It means that you don't see the godliness inside of it because it's covered by a shell. You don't see the potential inside of it because it's covered. But with your actions, with your thoughts, with your speech, with your involvement, you can take that thing and you can peel away that shell and uncover its potential, its holiness. That's amazing. In other words, what Alter Rebbe is telling us is that we are very powerful people. Every experience that we have, we either elevate the experience or we downgrade the experience. If we use, let's talk about kosher food, right? If you eat kosher food, which is not holy necessarily, it's just neutral, right? That's neutral. Then when you eat that, you say a blessing over it, you eat it, and you use that energy that was converted to help another person, to create programs that will help people, to give charity, to study Torah, to do a good deed. Then you're taking that food and you're making it holy. You're elevating it to holiness. If I eat food only for my beastly desires, in other words, beastly, I mean my animal soul is like an animal, remember. I'm eating it because I like this type of food, and there's no purpose for it whatsoever. I'm not going to use it for anything. I'm just going to eat it for the sake of eating it. Very selfishly. When I do that, I'm downgrading the experience. I'm taking that food, which was neutral, and I'm bringing it down to the shalosh klipat me'at, at least for the time being. That's a very strong place to be. This is chapter 7 and 8. Alter Rebbe is telling us, not only in your own self do you have the ability to choose, because your soul really comes from klipat noga. So you can either choose to express yourself, your speech, in a holy manner, your actions in a holy manner, or you can take something that's neutral in the world and elevate the experience by using it for the right thing, or you can downgrade the experience. But the point is that with this neutral entity, which is 98% of the world that a person encounters, the power is in us to choose to uncover the spark that God originally created it with, to uncover its potential and to bring out the godliness inside of it, or to miss the opportunity. The Torah says that until the flood, God did not allow Noah to eat animals. He could only eat vegetarian. He wasn't allowed to eat animals. After the flood, God allowed him to eat animals, to eat meat. Question is why? And the answer is, it's according to this, what we just said. A person is not allowed to eat meat according to the Torah if he's not going to elevate the meat that he's eating. The animal doesn't need us. We have the animalistic side to us, right? Animals don't have a godly side. They only have an animal side to them. So the animal needs us to eat the animal, to eat the meat, and to elevate the experience. In other words, we're taking that animal and we're elevating the animal to holiness. The animal doesn't have the ability to do that on its own. When we eat the animal and we elevate it, we make the animal holy. So the animal comes to us and the animal says, will you please eat me? But eat me with good intention, say a blessing over me. Then use out the energy for holiness. So you're taking the animal and you're elevating it. Before the flood, when all of the nations of the world were corrupt, when the world was not in a state of elevation, the world was a place that had no possibility to elevate. Until the flood came, the 40 days of water like a mikvah, and purified the world, then the world became a place that things could be elevated. But before the flood, there was no possibility to elevate things. Because of that, a human being had no business eating animals, because they weren't adding anything to the animals. They weren't helping the animals. They were just being animals themselves. Once the flood came and the world was purified, and the world had the ability now to elevate. So now, when you eat meat, you're eating that meat and you're elevating the animal. So now back to chapter 7 and 8. Everything in the world is either holy, neutral, or unholy. Holy, neutral, or impure. Sorry. The impurities I have no business being. If God says in the Torah I cannot eat something, I cannot eat it. End of the story. There's no way for me to access it. It's asur. Asur means it's not just forbidden, it's tied up. It's tied up, it's inaccessible. The spark inside of it is inaccessible. Most of the world is klipat noga. It's the translucent shell. In other words, there is a godly spark. There is potential inside of everything that we encounter, and we could uncover it. And we should uncover it. And we could, not only we should, we could, and not only we could, we should, and we have the responsibility to. That's why God put us in the world, to take the physical material world and to elevate it. And how do we elevate it? By saying a blessing over it, by doing a mitzvah with it, by using the converted energy for holiness. Then we take those things that God created in the world that were covered up, that the godly spark was hidden there, and we uncover it and we elevate it to holiness. So that is, my dear friends, altogether, that is a summary of chapters 1 through 8. Now that we have all this knowledge, Dr. Rebbe is going to tell us in chapter 9, now the battle begins. We have all the players in place. We're in the rink. We have the godly soul, the animal soul. We know the godly soul and animal soul strengths and weaknesses. We know what the purpose is, klipat noga, the purpose of a person in the world, human being. We know the microcosm and the macrocosm. And now we're ready to play Tanya. Now we're ready to play life. Now we're ready to get into the rink and figure out how to be victorious, how to be a Beinoni. We will continue, God willing, next week with chapter 9. Thank you all for joining once more. The recording is going to be up on YouTube together with all the other recordings. If you go to Chabad of Porta Vallarta on YouTube, you will see that there are many channels. One of them is Tanya, and all the recorded classings are there.